basement of the Birdcage Theater, Tombstone, Arizona, sometime in the 1880s. There's a poker table down here that has not stopped running since the doors opened in December 1881. Not for a night, not for an hour. Buy-in $1,000, real money, the kind a hard rock miner needed 3 years underground to earn. Adolphus Busch, the beer baron out of St. Louis, sits down some nights. So does Bat Masterson. Over the 8 years the table runs, roughly $10 million in wagers pass across its felt. The house never plays a hand, it just takes 10% off the top, every hand, every night, whether the miners upstairs are drinking or not. Call it $1 million skimmed off other men's luck without ever risking a dollar of its own. You'd think the man who owned that saloon died rich. He didn't. 3 months after the Birdcage opened, while it was pulling in more cash than almost any other business in the territory, its owner had already mortgaged the building. Revenue that size, and he still needed someone else's money to keep the doors open. That's the entire economics of owning a Wild West saloon, in one sentence, and almost nobody who romanticizes the swinging doors and the piano music understands why. Owning the room where the money changed hands was never the same thing as keeping any of it. So let's build one from the ground up, dollar by dollar, and find out exactly where it all went. Start with the paperwork, because the paperwork will confuse you before the whiskey ever does. A serious frontier saloon was rarely one man's property top to bottom. It was usually a stack. Someone owned the ground, someone else owned the building sitting on it, and a third man, the one whose name went over the door, owned only the business running inside those walls. The people at the top of that stack were often the last men in town you'd expect. Bankers, investors back east. Sometimes a mining company that owned half the lots on Main Street and simply leased out saloon space the way a modern landlord leases retail units. They collected rent whether the saloon below them thrived or failed, and when the reform societies came looking for someone to blame for the drinking and the gambling, the trail usually stopped at your name, not theirs. You held the risk, they held the deed. So what did it actually cost to get your name on that door? At the absolute bottom of the market, almost nothing. A fresh strike in an unnamed canyon needed nothing more than a tent, 2 barrels, a plank, and roughly $50 of rotgut whiskey to call itself a saloon by nightfall. That's not a hypothetical. It's how most frontier saloons were born, and it's exactly why there were so many of them. Leadville, Colorado sat near 15,000 residents at its peak, and roughly 120 saloons were pouring drinks for them at the same time, a saloon within a short walk of practically every doorstep in town. When the cost of entry is $50, everyone with a wagon and a grudge against honest labor becomes your competitor by sundown. Surviving past your first season meant spending money nobody could see a return on right away. The back bar was the first trap. A proper carved back bar, the towering mirrored altar behind the bartender that every respectable saloon needed, routinely cost more than the actual bar customers leaned against. Add French plate mirrors shipped west by rail. Brass foot rails, a gas chandelier, a billiard table freighted in from a manufacturer back east. None of it poured a single drink. All of it existed to convince a customer your 2-bit whiskey was worth more than the 12-cent version being poured in the tent across the street. Then the government wanted its cut, and this is where the math turns brutal fast. A federal retail liquor stamp ran about $25 a year, cheap. The city license was the real bite. Fort Worth charged $650 a year for the privilege, at a time when a cowhand's wages ran around $30 a month. That's over 2 years of a working cowboy's pay just for the paper on your wall before you've covered rent, before you've bought a drop of stock. And in towns that adopted so-called high license laws specifically to squeeze independent operators out of business, that number could run past $2,000 a year. Chicago raised its license fee sharply in 1884 for exactly this reason, to price small, independent saloon keepers out of existence. We'll come back to who benefited from that. The stock itself, at least, looked cheap on paper. Rectified whiskey, raw grain alcohol redistilled and doctored with burnt sugar, tobacco juice, sometimes a literal rattlesnake head dropped into the barrel for spirit, wholesaled for as little as $3 or $4 a gallon. A gallon poured out to well over 100 shots. At 2 bits a shot, that 1 gallon could return you $30 or more before you'd added a drop of river water to stretch it further, which almost everyone did. On the surface, the whiskey math looks like the best return on capital in the entire territory. Hold that number, because it's about to look a lot smaller than it seems. Now staff the place, because a real saloon wasn't a one-man operation. It was a small, strange company. Bartenders considered themselves skilled professionals, not desperate men wiping glasses for tips, and in some cities they organized well enough to have their own trade unions. Below them, porters, a cigar counterman, sometimes a bootblack, and then one line item that tells you everything about how business actually got done out here. Many of the larger houses paid a portion of a city policeman's wage directly out of the till, in exchange for keeping trouble away from their particular doorway. A sworn public officer privately retained by one business on the block. Nobody in town thought that was strange. The women working the floor ran the best margin in the entire building, and they weren't on your payroll at all. They worked on commission. A dance cost the customer around $0.25 to $1, split between the house and the girl. After the dance, she'd steer her partner back to the bar, where the real trick kicked in. Her drink cost the same quarter his did, but her glass held cold tea dyed to look the part. He paid full whiskey price for a beverage that cost you next to nothing, never spoiled, and never made her too drunk to sell the next round. Multiply that across a busy floor on a Saturday night, and the fake drink quietly out-earned the real one. But none of this, not the bar, not the tea, not the license, not the mirrors, was ever the actual business. The actual business was downstairs or in the back room, at the tables. Go back to the Birdcage's basement game. $10 million in wagers over 8 years, 10% skimmed by the house on every hand, adds up to something close to $1 million extracted from other men's luck without the house ever once betting its own money against a player. Compare that to what a modest, well-run bar might gross in cash sales over the same stretch of years, even at those generous whiskey margins, and it isn't close. The bar sold a product once, to one man, one time. The table sold the same dollar back to the same man, over and over, all night long, for as long as he had money in his pocket and the nerve to keep sitting. Who captured that value? Rarely the man whose name hung over the front door. Professional gamblers frequently rented the floor space for their tables rather than working for the saloon keeper, bringing their own bankroll and keeping the lion's share of what they won, paying the house only a fee or a percentage for the privilege of dealing under his roof. The house took a smaller cut of a much bigger number and called it a good arrangement, because the alternative, staking your own 5-figure bankroll against strangers every single night, could bankrupt you in a single unlucky hand. Ownership of the room did not mean ownership of the money moving through it. Here's where the story turns uncomfortable. The same pattern running through your gambling hall was running through your beer taps too, and this time you were the one being owned. By the 1880s, the big Midwestern breweries had figured out something that modern franchise executives would recognize instantly. Beer spoiled. A brewery without a guaranteed outlet watched its product die in a warehouse before it ever reached a glass. So the breweries stopped waiting for saloons to open and started building them directly. In Milwaukee, 4 giants, Pabst, Schlitz, Miller, and Blatz, made it nearly impossible for an independent operator to open a saloon without their backing. In 1884 alone, those breweries bought up more than 200 corner lots across the city, purely to plant exclusive saloons on the best intersections before anyone else could. In Chicago that same year, the city hiked license fees specifically to drive small operators out of business, and the breweries were waiting on the other side of that squeeze, offering to cover the license, the fixtures, the building itself, in exchange for one signature on an exclusivity contract, only their beer, forever, at terms they set. Adolphus Busch, the man sitting at that basement poker table in Tombstone gambling with the locals, ran exactly this operation back home in St. Louis, building saloons, financing keepers who couldn't otherwise afford to open, locking every one of them into his taps alone. The same man extracting money from an independent Arizona gambling hall for sport was, in his day job, steadily assembling one of the largest tied house networks in the country. The sign over your door said your name, The mortgage, the fixtures, and the tap said someone else's. Historians call this the tied house system, and structurally it is close to indistinguishable from a modern hotel or restaurant franchise agreement. The corporation supplies the capital and the brand, the little guy supplies the labor, the risk, and the late nights, and the money flows uphill regardless of who's actually standing behind the bar on any given Tuesday. This wasn't a Milwaukee curiosity that stayed in Milwaukee. The same model spread through Chicago, through St. Louis, through nearly every mid-sized American city with a brewery ambitious enough to want guaranteed shelf space, and it followed the railroads west into the same boomtowns that thought they were the last free frontier of small business in America. By the time Prohibition finally shut the whole system down in 1919, tied houses controlled by breweries made up a majority of the retail liquor trade in some cities, meaning the independent saloon keeper of American legend, the man whose name was painted over the door, was, more often than the myth admits, already working for somebody else's balance sheet before he ever poured his first drink. Even your license, the thing that was supposed to protect your business, could be turned into a weapon against you. A city council with a grudge, a reform candidate who wanted the vice cleaned off Main Street, a rival saloon with better friends at City Hall. Any of them could push for ordinances or license hikes that applied to every saloon in town on paper, and to exactly one saloon in practice. Your permission to operate was never really yours. It was rented from people who could revoke it whenever it suited them politically, and there was no court on the frontier that moved fast enough to save you before the damage was done. 3 different ways all of this collapsed, and any single one of them alone was enough to end you. Fire first, and your own inventory was the fuel. These were wood-frame buildings lit by oil lamps, packed nightly with drunk men holding open flames, standing shoulder to shoulder with other wood-frame buildings just like them. Boomtown business districts burned down with a regularity that would be unthinkable today. Deadwood saw much of its commercial heart go up in flame in 1879, and it was far from the only camp to lose entire blocks of saloons in a single night. There was no meaningful insurance industry out here willing to underwrite a building full of alcohol and open flame at any price a saloon keeper could actually afford. If it burned, you rebuilt on credit, assuming anyone would extend you any, or you simply didn't reopen. Second, the ground could move out from under you politically. A city council changes hands. The rules change with it. License renewals, new ordinances, a sympathetic judge replaced by an unsympathetic one. The game could flip entirely between one election and the next, and a saloon that had operated cleanly for years could suddenly find itself the sole target of enforcement that, on paper, applied to everyone. Third, and this one killed entire towns at once rather than just single businesses, your whole customer base could simply relocate. The great cattle drive saloons didn't die from bad management. They died because the railroad kept moving west. Abilene was the wildest, richest cattle town in Kansas until the railhead shifted and the herds started arriving somewhere else instead. And then Ellsworth had its turn, and then Wichita, and then Dodge City, each one inheriting the boom for a few roaring years before the trail moved on again and took the cowboys, and their wages, and every saloon depending on them, with it. You could run the cleanest, most honest bar in the territory and still go broke inside 18 months, not because you did anything wrong, but because the entire economic reason your town existed had simply packed up and moved 300 miles down the line. Run the 2 versions of this business that every saloon keeper eventually lived through. In the good years, in a town still riding its boom, the math looks almost unbeatable. Whiskey returning multiples of its cost before you've even watered it down, a gambling concession paying you a fee for the privilege of out-earning your own bar, dance floor commissions rolling in on drinks that cost you nothing to pour, and a brewery covering your license and your fixtures in exchange for exclusivity you barely noticed signing away. In a year like that, you could out-earn the town doctor, the assier, and the newspaper editor combined, and plenty of frontier saloon keepers did exactly that. One bad season away, though, the other version was always waiting, and it rarely announced itself in advance. A cigar meets a spilled barrel, and there's no insurance check coming. A rival with better friends downtown gets your license reviewed. The railhead moves, or the ore plays out, or the reformers finally win an election, and the men who spent their wages at your rail simply cease to exist in your town. Meanwhile, your fixed costs never blinked. The brewery's contract still binds you, the license fee still comes due, the rent to whoever actually owns your building still needs paying, whether or not there's a single customer left standing at the bar to cover it. Which brings us back to the birdcage, because it's the cleanest example on the record of exactly how this ends. That basement table generated something close to $1 million for the house over 8 years, in a building that took in more cash in its opening months than almost any other business in the entire territory. And its owner had already mortgaged the place within its first 3 months of operation. Enormous revenue, constant cash changing hands, and the man whose name was on the building still didn't own it free and clear. He owned the risk. Someone else, quietly, held the paper. That's the pattern underneath every romantic image the Wild West saloon ever produced. The men who actually built lasting fortunes out here were rarely the ones standing behind the bar every night, soaking up the gunfights and the fires and the boom and bust of a single town's luck. They were the ones who owned the ground the saloon sat on and collected rent regardless of who was pouring drinks upstairs. They were the brewers back in Milwaukee and St. Louis, financing hundreds of saloons at once and collecting from every one of them whether that particular saloon thrived or burned to its foundation that year. They were the professional gamblers who rented a table for a season, took their winnings, and rode out before the town's luck turned, leaving the building and its debts behind for someone else to inherit. Standing behind the bar, he took the punches. He absorbed the fire risk, argued with the tax collector, kept the peace with a shotgun and a privately paid badge, and bet his entire livelihood on a boom he had no control over and no way to predict the end of. He was never really the owner of the wealth flowing through his own building. He was only ever its landlord, collecting rent on other men's vices, on borrowed money, in a town that could vanish the moment the reason for its existence ran dry. And his lease, like every saloon's lease on the frontier, was never any longer than the boom that built it.